Good morning. Happy Thanksgiving. It is the 26th of November, 2020. Pastor Ron Jetter, Immanuel Lutheran Church, Grandview, Washington. On this, the 400th celebration of the annual American Harvest Festival that began in 1621 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And it began quite by accident, it seems. In fact, a lot of what we know about the history of Thanksgiving is from legend. It has taken on so much more. I mean, think of Christmas. Who was Nicholas, a bishop of the early church of the Asia Minor city of Myra? And Nicholas, being a bishop, wore red or white, we aren't sure, but somehow he became, because of the Dutch, Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas in their language. And of course then with Clement Clark Moore grew into the rather corpulent jolly man in the red suit with the white fur lining and the sleigh and the reindeer and all of that. And my goodness, Thanksgiving likewise has enjoyed the same embellishments, but that original Thanksgiving, the first thing that we need to recall is that they weren't intending to go to Plymouth, Massachusetts. They were headed for the Jamestown colonies to settle in Virginia because in 1605 the first settlement had established itself and England continued to send more people. They went there partly for religious freedom, but partly for the freedom to be religiously strict. That is to say, to stamp out religious freedom, to replace the Church of England with their own version of a theocracy, a nation in which God directly ruled, in which there was no separation between church and state. They liked the idea that there was a holy ruler that was absolute in all of government and all of church, as Henry had done not so much earlier in England, as the Holy Roman Emperor had done throughout much of the church's history. But they wanted their own version, and they wanted it exactly the way they wanted it. But the trouble was, the Mayflower was running out of the one commodity they needed most. Well, it wasn't water, it was beer. That's the part of the story we didn't learn as kids in school, that historians tell us they had up to a gallon of beer per day set aside for the journey, but they were running low. You'd think that would be more than enough. Yes. But they then ended up landing in Massachusetts rather than going on to Virginia and establishing the colony there in 1620. It's true that they did receive help from the Wampanoag, the local tribal people there, and these were agrarian. They weren't hunter-gatherers alone, although they certainly were that as well. But their diet was deer, wild game such as pheasant, turkey, and duck, which were all plentiful, and shellfish and fish. So Atlantic cod and clams, very prevalent in that area. So the Wampanoag taught them apparently how to use parts of fish or even whole fish as fertilizer, to place them in the ground to allow there to be some food for that seed, the corn seed, perhaps one of the earlier crops, for it to then grow a bountiful crop. The Wampanoag had a history, according to historical studies, of giving thanks as an activity in response to anything that they considered a blessing. In other words, you may have a prayer of thanksgiving 5 or 6 times a day. There may be a day or two when you don't have it, but at least once a day, a Wampanoag would give thanks to the Great Spirit who provided everything. They never lost sight of the fact that everything they had was from God. The Puritans who ended up in Plymouth, who founded the Plymouth plantation, were much the same way. But there was a 3-day festival sometime between September and November in which they decided that they needed to give thanks specifically for the abundant harvest. Half of the colony, including 75% of the women, did not survive that first winter of 1620, 1621. Gotta get the date straight here, but 400 years. Yeah, well, so next year will be the 400th anniversary of Thanksgiving. What did they eat at that Thanksgiving? Well, venison, we know that, and probably cod and clams. They may have had some wild bird, probably pheasant or duck. We're not sure that it was turkey. It appears the turkey came in sometime later, sometime between then and the time of the what we consider the American colonialists, Washington's time. They had declared the turkey the national bird because it was so prevalent and such a proud, majestic bird. Comedian Stan Freberg does this wonderful bit in a musical that never got produced on Broadway, but it's great to listen to. It's called The United States of America. There are parts 1 and part 2, produced about 40 years apart. But in one of the skits, there's 2 people in the kitchen, and one of them says, "Geez, Charlie, what do you mean you cook the turkey instead of the eagle? I had my mouth set on roast eagle with all the trimmings. You've gone and put our national bird in the oven." Well, the 2 birds, they were lying there side by side, and I didn't know. That turkey was for the centerpiece, Charlie. What are we going to do? I mean, it's a little scrawny, isn't it? Well, I thought I'd stuff some old bread in it and make it look a little fatter. Oh, okay, you do that. Funny little bits to... we can revise history in comic ways or in ways that simply embellish it. I remember exchange students sitting at Thanksgiving dinner with us going, "I thought this was a Hollywood thing, that only people in movies did this." Nope, pretty much every home in America on the 4th Thursday of November will do some version of this, and the vast majority of us will have what we consider the traditional Thanksgiving: the turkey, the cranberries, the potatoes. The Pilgrims, by the way, they didn't call themselves Pilgrim. That term wouldn't come for another 200 years. They were Puritans of the Plymouth plantation. They would have had cranberries, probably blackberries too. Pumpkin, yeah, they would have perhaps carved up a pumpkin, cut it up, boiled it, and eaten it as squash. They certainly didn't have the wheat and the sugar and the butter to make a pie, or the eggs. They had eggs, but they didn't necessarily make pumpkin custard. They didn't have sugar in any quantities, so they would have eaten it as squash, like we would eat a butternut squash or something like that, maybe with salt on it even. Cranberry would have been a tart kind of relish. Again, without the sugar, they didn't make cranberry sauce. Potatoes were one of those uniquely North American foods, as was corn, as were cranberries, as were pumpkins and other kinds of squash that we introduced to the rest of the world. But there's no evidence that they had potatoes at that first dinner. One of the things that I mentioned before is that people in this country have been very divided, and both sides of the politics in the recent election have had spokespeople who said of the other people, God is not on their side, that there are no true believers in that other political party, or that the people on that party and the decisions they made are going to be judged by God. This is crossing a line. This is violating that commandment that says you will not take the Lord's name in vain. Because thanksgiving is grounded first and foremost, not in arrogance, but in humility, abject poverty of soul that says, when we have received a blessing, we must acknowledge the giver. A lot of people today won't even have a prayer at their table. A lot of people today will have tables that are lacking someone they love, and they will nonetheless give thanks. Those are kind of the two poles of the continuum. To me, it makes no sense to give thanks if you don't, first of all, recognize the giver. I wasn't an English major, but I love the English language, and you can have a direct object and an indirect object. And there are people who will give thanks and list all of the things they're thankful for, the indirect object, without ever getting to the direct object. Who are we thankful to? Well, to God. You can be thankful to God without ever having to list that litany of stuff. But a lot of people, what are we thankful for? And they'll bypass the direct object, the one worthy of our thanks and praise at all times and in all places. On this Thanksgiving today, I am praying with you and for you, for John and Suzanne, as she has to visit him in a hospital in an ICU following successful surgery, heart surgery, but not sitting around the table eating turkey and cranberries and mashed potatoes. For Andrea and her family, who have just lost her father, and all of them as they grieve now, and the memories, the sitting around the table laughing and crying and remembering Thanksgivings of the past, but no more Thanksgiving with Dad, who is gone. With those struggling with illnesses, those still waiting for medical tests, Dave and Em and so many others, for the family of young Jazzy, whose life as a teenager ended with cancer a week ago. All of the people, all of you, there is a spirit in you that wants to give thanks in recognition that God still loves you. In fact, maybe God's love is especially for you on this day. You're not the one who is distracted by all of the cooking and the details and getting the settings just right and making sure that the linens are pressed and the wine is chilled and all of those things. You're more like those early Plymouth plantation people and the Wampanoags who joined with them. It was a different kind of day. It was a day to simply say, wow, we're survivors. We'll get through this. A record number of kids, teenagers, kids in their 20s are at home this Thanksgiving. COVID has done that. They can't go back to college because they left, or they have had to move back in because of economics. Wow. It's a tough time. That makes it especially important that we give thanks to God. God is caring for us on this day. Peace be with you.